hear me okay? Robot lady telling me you're recording me. Hello everybody, I hope you can hear me okay. If there's any issues with tech or microphones, stuff like that, you can write in the chat box for us, and Michaela, who is our brilliant SASS assistant and expert in all things Zoom, will be able to resolve these issues. We're going to get started by introducing our panelists. So I will introduce Dr. Megan Norris first. She is a social psychologist. She's the undergrad chair in psychology and Psych 100 Prof. And her research interests focus on facilitating student success, which is very convenient for us today because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. I'm also joined by Jason Summers, who is one of the resident outreach counselors. As part of his work, he focuses on one-on-one psychotherapy appointments with mostly first-year students and the creation and implementation of mental health programs and trainings. I'm Dr. Ian Garner, and I work in academic skills and writing support at Student Academic Success Services. I do a ton of work in group settings, workshops like this, doing small support for students in whatever writing and academic skills support they need. I thought we would get started with some words of wisdom from both Megan and Jason. So I'm going to give them a couple of minutes just to say hello and give you some pieces of advice first. Then we had some pre-submitted questions. We can answer some of those. But throughout this, if you type in the chat box more questions as you go, things you would like Megan or I or Jason to answer, then we will hopefully get back to you. Feel free to comment, ask us for further details or clarification. We can do that. And if you want to ask a question that you kind of don't want anybody else to see, you can just privately message me and I will tell nobody that you asked a particular question. Okay, Megan and Jason, who would like to go first?
Jason, you go ahead.
Oh, fantastic. I'm going first. So again, my name is Jason Summers. I work in residence. Before working in residence, I was the embedded counselor for engineering. And then before that, I was studying to be a counselor. Thinking back to kind of my undergrad, certainly exams were something that I needed to learn how to do. I didn't know how to study going into my first year. It was around the 3rd or 4th week of October that I visited U of T's equivalent of SASS because I realized you needed to study for midterms and there were consequences if you didn't. I made it through my biology, I made it through calculus, I didn't. I got a 14, a number I didn't know you could get on a test if you tried, but I tried really hard and got a 14. So kind of learning through these things and kind of learning how to study is something that I ended up working on quite a bit through my undergrad. And then I ended up doing a bit of a research project on that in my 4th year. My 4th year research project was students' understanding and also knowledge of taking multiple choice tests and learning biology.
Thank you, Jason. I'm glad you actually pointed out that kind of grade of getting a 14 on a midterm, and it brought back some difficult memories for me as well. I spent some time studying music in Russia as well as doing my undergraduate degree in England, and I'd done really well in England. I felt very confident. The first quiz that we did in Russia, I absolutely bombed it. It was a music harmony quiz, and I got like a D for dumps, and I was so embarrassed. I was in a class with people that were like 17, 18 years old. They were getting A's. They were so confident, and it was really hard kind of stepping back and figuring out the path forward for there. It's a real knock to your confidence when you feel like you're a good student, and then suddenly you feel like you aren't. And it's such a common experience that we see among students at Queen's as well. Mm-hmm. Megan, did you want to chip in with some thoughts?
Yeah, I love that we're kind of normalizing that sometimes things don't go our way, right? Like I think, and Michaela, I see you just posted in the chat, like None of us are perfect. And sometimes, you know, we think we prepare really well and maybe the exam is not what we expected. Or maybe like, I don't know, like I think a lot about professional athletes, right? And these people get paid millions of dollars to show up on the field or the court. And even they have bad days, right? And we know that they're fantastic at what they do. And so sometimes it's just not our day. And that's okay. So I think something that really took me time to figure out and learn is that, you know, we always try our best, and we're going to talk about ways to set yourself up to do your best here tonight. But, you know, it's okay sometimes if it's a bad day. That's not the end of the world, and we can come back from it. And it's kind of normal for first year to sometimes maybe be a big learning curve in a lot of ways. The other thing, sharing personal sort of anecdotes, my mantra, especially in this time of COVID when things are so weird and thinking about prepping, is all or something. So sometimes we get into this all or nothing type of thinking about, you know, if I don't have 3 hours to sit down and study, I'm not going to do it because I need this time to get my head into it. And you know what? That's not necessarily a good way to think about it. Sometimes all or something is the way to go. And so even if it's 20 minutes, and if even you get through one paragraph, well, that's one paragraph more than you would have if you didn't do anything. So that's been kind of how I'm getting through some of these days when work is really heavy and we're working in our basements, and you know, things are a little weird right now.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I mean, we'll probably throughout the rest of this talk a lot about kind of perfect preparation plans, and here's the things you could and should be doing. But there's a huge difference between doing nothing and even 5 or 10 minutes quickly revising for a question, rereading a paragraph, writing a little summary, doing a practice answer, even talking out loud to yourself and talking yourself through a topic. These are all just as valid and effective ways to study. And actually, I'm sure Megan will be able to talk about this. The research says in some ways, sometimes these can be better ways to study than feeling like you've got to be sitting down for 3, 4, 5 hours at a time. And yet that's what the culture at Queen's, and I think universities in general, tells us what we should be doing. We should be focusing for these huge blocks of time and spending 3 days solid preparing for psych, then moving on to bio, then moving on to something else. Actually, maybe not the most effective way. We'll come back to that because we have quite a lot of questions that were submitted in advance. We won't take all of them, but feel free, like I said, to just add some questions in the chat box and we will talk about really whatever you want to talk about. We have, I think, a good range of expertise between the people on the panel. So the first question I'm going to throw to you first, Jason, and this is a big one, and it's one we've heard some variation on a lot in the last few weeks, and I would say a lot this year compared to previous years, or as I call them, normal years. And that question is, I feel totally overwhelmed. I'm procrastinating, I can't get started. What's the best way to get back on track? What can I do right now if I'm feeling this way and if I'm really not feeling good, Jason?
I think like stepping into what this year looks like, I would also be just totally overwhelmed with trying to kind of hold on to everything that's going on. And procrastinating makes a lot of sense. When I'm procrastinating in that moment, I think I'm doing what's best for me because it feels good. There's the anxiety of feeling overwhelmed. I step away in whatever that procrastination is, and I'm self-soothing in that space. It's sometimes looking at the transition between self-soothing or procrastinating and, you know, that self-care aspect of setting myself up for being able to kind of tackle what's at hand. If I'm feeling overwhelmed on a lot of aspects, I think it's touching on that. That's often kind of the stress is higher, my anxiety might be kind of brought up in different ways, and that's gonna be harder to pull away from. And so even checking in with myself before starting and sitting down with my work, especially if for the last 2 weeks, for great reasons, every time I sit down, I get overwhelmed, or every time I find myself trying to sit down with my work, these feelings are coming back up. Taking the time to even name them or take 5 minutes to like do some sort of bridging activity before starting work. If that's, you know, I want to read an article outside of school, if I want to do like a Sudoku or something to kind of remember that kind of getting into work and starting things is certainly a bit of, sorry, I got caught up in the comment. Starting things takes a bit of work. For me, it's about 5 or 10 minutes of sitting down with any sort of, or it was with any sort of schoolwork. Now with any work that I am doing, if I'm doing a project, I need to like suffer through 5 minutes of doing nothing before my head gets rolling on different things. Working with students, when I first started, I worked in a Center for Students with Disabilities at Carleton. And we talked a lot about like, we're really good at the first step of planning how I'm going to get everything done. But the second step is the hardest because it's often where I'm nervous I'm going to make the first mistake. So even setting like a timer or something to say, I'm going to at least like stare or attempt and be okay with making mistakes for the first 10 minutes or things like that can be helpful. If I find that like I can't, like my relationship with schoolwork is like so far done that even thinking about starting school is causing me to be overwhelmed or anxious, I'd certainly plug student wellness services or reaching out, because that's something that we'd be happy to talk through. But I also don't want to take too much time. I'm sure other people have ideas.
Megan, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
I think, you know, I'll speak anecdotally. So I'll talk a little bit about what I find works for me, and in talking with students, some things just to throw out some ideas. So I think what might be a comfortable strategy for one person might or might not work for another. So I'll share, you know, sometimes, like, especially if I have to write a paper, and as part of my job, I have to write a lot of papers. And sometimes they're papers that I might even be like intellectually curious and excited about, but oh my goodness, like writing papers, even though I love it as part of my job, like it's still hard, right? Like getting going can still be hard. So I actually have a buddy, she's in Kansas, and we were professors together at our first appointment, and we still will do like a FaceTime where we're not actually talking to each other. And we're like, okay, I'm going to open the Word document. Are you opening a Word document on your end? And just to have somebody there, and we like hear each other typing, and we'll take a few minutes to bridge. So we'll get our tea. It really just helps to have that social support. For me, I know it doesn't work for everybody, but that's one idea that can work. Another strategy that I've started doing, and some days it works and some days it doesn't, is like we're at screens all the time now. And so sometimes, like, you know, it's hard to be at the screen again. So I'll open a Google Doc and use the voice dictation, and I'll just talk. And I know it's going to be garbage because dictation's not perfect. And so I find it takes the pressure off of getting a solid first draft, because I know that even if it were perfect, it's going to be weird on the page as a result of the dictation tool. And so that's another way that I kind of like to get started. And then once you have a messy first draft, well, then you can have something to work with. So for me, I find it's getting that first bit down that's really challenging.
Excellent. These are great ideas. As somebody who has a book chapter due in 19 days from now and has not started writing, I will be using some of them. But I think the key with procrastination, and Sierra, I really like your comment that, you know, procrastination is not about being lazy. Everybody procrastinates. You'll procrastinate, Megan procrastinates, Jason does it, I do it. The greatest people in the world, we all do it because procrastination is about anxiety and fear. You don't want to get working on that big project because it's too large, you're not sure how to get started, it's intimidating, it's something new. And right now, especially if you're in first year, you're going through this period where you're constantly faced with big new challenges. You've never written your first university paper until a few months ago, or a lab report, and now you've got to do this first big set of exams, and you're in a very unusual situation as well, where everything really is new. And so naturally we're procrastinating more than usual, but the key really is to find a way to get started. A strategy that actually neither of you mentioned, but I like to use, is to think about starting your workday in some small fashion, and to think about how can I strip away all the possible distractions? Can I have like a study kit, a bag with everything I need, so that if I don't have a nice kind of study area or a room where I'm going to go to study, when it's time, I know I can just open this up and I have all my books, all my pencils, I've got the calculator in there, I've got the laptop there, all that stuff, so that you're trying to separate work life from home life. Because right now, especially, you're in the same space a lot. You're staring at the same box to watch Netflix, to look at social media, to do all the relaxing stuff, and to do the work stuff. And that just makes things hard, and it turns your brain to mush a little bit when you're just in the same place, you know, physically doing the same kinds of things and trying to switch your attention between tasks. So anything you can do to separate those things out is going to help you just find a way to move forward and get started.
I did hear, can I jump onto that? You might have been in, it was in a webinar, and I thought it was really great. Somebody was talking about the challenge of when you have one primary device and it's both leisure and work, that they have their timer at 5 o'clock for this person every day. They shut it down, and they will actually out loud say, it is shutting down procedure, and they will shut down their computer and close it, walk a few feet away, and then open it up and Netflix or do whatever they're going to do. But they try to give themselves that cue. So, you know, in our daily lives, we have lots of cues. Like if you walk into a lecture theater, you see a seat, you sit down. And there's these cues for our behavior. So I thought that was a really smart kind of cue that might be easy for people to do.
Yeah, it sounds silly, but all these tiny little things will add up. So if you're feeling that way, if you're struggling with procrastination, that is a good start. Let's take another question from the list, and I'm going to throw this one at Megan because she knows a little bit about Psych 100, and I think this is a question that's related to Psych 100. Megan, tell us, what is the most effective way to study for courses that seem to have just a huge amount of content?
Yeah,
like Psych 100.
I think it's easy to get lost in the details, and obviously details matter, right? So I don't want to say details don't matter. Details do matter. But what matters also is the big picture. And so one of the things that we really try to encourage students to do in Psych 100, we've partnered with SASS, and we have this sort of 3-step reading method. And the first part is, let's just go through and find the learning objectives, look at the headings that are in the chapters, and let's start there. Because that gives us a skeleton that we can start to hang information on. And so I would say a really great study session is just getting those onto a sheet and then take a break. You're sort of primed to think a little bit about what those content areas are, and then come back and go through at a more detailed level. And then those details, you can start matching them up to those areas that you've listed out in terms of learning objectives and the major headings. And so that would be sort of the first step. Obviously, with studying, as with anything, like humans, for those of you in Psych 100, we talk a lot about this. Humans are limited capacity machines. We can't process everything. We're not going to remember everything. And so part of it is through that reading and starting to sort things out, you'll start to notice themes that come up and connect units. And so as you start to notice those themes, and you kind of start to say, okay, so here's the skeleton, here's this framework, and whoa, I just wrote about heritability a few chapters ago, and I see it come up again now. Can I make a connection between these two topics? And by sort of elaborative encoding and making those connections, you're going to be better prepared for the exams, which matter. And I know we're talking about exams in the context of this, but also if you're planning on going on in psychology, or if you ever want to use this in your job, whether it's psychology or another discipline down the road. So we really want to try to facilitate students, one, starting with that skeleton. And really, at the end of the day, if all you have is a skeleton, don't get me wrong, you might not get 100% on the exam, but you have something. You know that this was a learning objective, and you know what some of the headings for the chapter were. So I think that's a pretty good start. And then building mastery by going through and filling in the details and making connections as you go.
Excellent. I'm just going to jump off of that and to think about, we were talking about this earlier. I was talking with some students about multiple choice exams in general. And I would say that students tend to do two things too much. Firstly, make summaries. summarizing notes, rewriting notes, the research shows that that's of limited value. I understand why it feels like it's really useful. It feels like it's really productive to go over a textbook chapter and rewrite the things that are important to pull material out. And the other thing that students do too much is cue cards or flashcards. You know, where you look at the title or the name of a phenomenon or an idea, and then on the back you've got the definition or the explanation. The problem with these approaches to studying is that they're very passive. You're not really doing much when you study that way to build those connections and see how things are conceptually organized across the course. And so what you tend to see is that students will then be in the exam, on a multiple choice exam, and if they've done a ton of work, and I often talk to students who've done hours and hours and hours of prep, and they're really well drilled on the facts they know, but as soon as they see a question that is just slightly outside of what they've seen before, that asks them to join the dots between different parts of the course, they just can't do it because they haven't trained for it. And so even if you're studying for a multiple choice exam, an exam like Psych 100, Bio is another good example. English 100, I don't think is doing definitions this year, but you know, definitions of literary terms and where are they used. It feels like you should just go through and make lists of these things and make cue cards and review them and review them and review them. But what I would recommend you do is do more work that's teaching material to other people, explaining it out loud, that is making things like mind maps, where you're trying to map out how different parts of a course connect with each other. You can do practice written answers. Give yourself a miniature essay question, and even if you just dictate it into your Google Voice app or whatever you've got, you can write it in a different language. You don't have to write it in English. You can write it in bullet points. You can write it in terrible English, right? But by writing or talking in a more fulsome way about something, you're going to be able to start to draw connections between different parts of the course together, rather than just seeing things in this very superficial way. And along the way, if you do this, you will find you will pick up a lot of the detail as you go, because you are forced to go back to your notes when you need them and where you need them. So it's just a bit more an effective way to study.
Yeah, and for Psych 100, I want to note that 2/3 of the weight of the exam are actually on written answer. So we do have multiple choice, but the bulk of the exam is being able to make connections and put things together. So for those students in Psych 100, we have a part of the discussion board where students are just generating practice exam questions to share with one another. That's a really great place to go and work on them. We've released some through a course announcement, and there's a lab happening this week that's working through some possible short answer questions, written answer questions. And then also we have many written submissions through weekly labs in Psych 100. Those are another really great thing to return to. And again, making those connections throughout the weeks of the course.
Yeah, and another shout out to the idea of looking at learning objectives. Why has the prof put together this course in this particular way? It often seems really arbitrary when you're in a course. Why are we moving from this topic to this topic to this topic? But it's not. The profs have usually structured their thinking in a very specific way, and they want you to understand these things on a conceptual way in a conceptual way rather than in this superficial way. I'm going to take another question from my list, and then I will open things up and see if other people have questions. I'm going to ask another question to Jason, because I've heard you talk about this and I think you'll have some good ideas. What if I get nervous before exams? Either, Jason, that kind of nervousness that, you know, I just don't feel that great, or that really sort of full-fledged, I really completely blank, I'm so nervous I can barely function. What would you advise to either of those kinds of nervousness, or someone in the middle? I don't know, you take it away. What do you think?
Megan, let me know if I don't speak to the current circumstance, because I have spoken to this quite a bit, but also like some of my prepared answers, I'm like, can someone do that on how exams are currently written? But to speak through, I think oftentimes students will come and it's like this nervousness before a test where like the night before, like all I feel like I can do is cram, and like it's difficult to sleep or focus on anything else, I recognize that that's kind of where I was a lot of times during my exams as well, where when our stress or anxiety is higher, we're going to want to focus on what's kind of perceived as the threat, fight or flight. We're going to get fused. And that would make sense that like my stomach is a little bit tighter. I have a little bit, it's a little bit more difficult to kind of fall asleep. But if we're able to take kind of those deep breaths or think about what's best for us in kind of the next 24 hours for preparing, rather than cramming, if we know we have the information at hand, is that for me, making sure I call like a loved one or taking a walk or like taking the night to myself to be in a state where I'm a little bit less stressed, more rested, and can kind of come into the exam the next day or later in the day. I often tell students, like, it feels like I'm going to learn things 2 hours before an exam, but I never have. For the kind of more heightened anxiety of walking into, I walk into my exam and like, I have forgotten everything. I think to my first year physics exam, it was 20 multiple choice questions. And I had been to a place, the equivalent of SASS, and they said, if you get worried, make sure you read through every question, find the ones that answer those ones first, and then it'll be okay. And I went through the 20 questions and I knew how to answer one. So then I was more worried because I was batting 5%. In those spaces, like our heart rate often is going to go up. We're going to feel really tight, or I felt really tight. I kept checking the clock. And it was those kind of clues for myself that my stress level was high. When our stress level is high, I'll let you know kind of right off the bat, the biggest thing we have control over is our breath. It feels like we're controlling our heart rate. We're actually controlling our lungs, or like the space right behind our lungs. But what we want to try to do is take 1 to 5 minutes to kind of put the test aside and take the deep breaths, because when our heart rate is up and we're in a stressful place, our brain is very good at letting us know that we're in danger or letting us know that we should feel stressed. If we can take control over our breath and our heart rate, it actually allows us to see a little bit more context and around and kind of help with that problem solving. Psych 100, we're no longer thinking strictly with our hippocampus amygdala. We're opening things up to the total brain. Ways to do that, I really like what's called square breathing, if you want to look into that. I really like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, although I think that might look weird in a space, but that's kind of walking through my 5 senses to keep a little bit more present. Anxiety likes the future, but the test is happening currently. And then also, if we have a piece of paper or we're able, even before starting a test, to look into writing down what I do know, not even allowing myself to look at the test before remembering that I have studied, I have prepared, there are things that I know. So when that kind of fear response of like, I know nothing comes up, I already have a rebuttal to that. It's kind of my 2 cents, but welcomed for anyone to add anything.
We do know that some students are going to have a new experience in testing where there will be some exams, Psych 100 is one, that is forward only, which means you're going to get a set of multiple choice items on a page. You'll have a chance to respond to those set, read through that set before you save and move on. And once you move on, you won't be able to return to it. This format's actually used in a number of standard testing environments too. So this won't be the only time you see it, even after COVID. This is the format of my GREs when I took them, what feels like a millennia ago. But these strategies, I want to let you know, can still come into play here. So even if you have a limited question set, you can still read through those 3, 5, however many questions that you have, answer them. And if you don't know the answers, that's okay. At least in Psych 100, I can't speak to the other exams, but I love the idea of, I used to do this on my exams all the time. So if you were allowed to like write on the sides, I would write down like everything I know, and I had like acronyms, you know, for everything. And as soon as the exam was a start, before I even looked at it, I would get down the things out of my head that I needed to get out of my head to feel confident. You can still do that in Psych 100. So you'll be able to, if you want to take notes, you can. You can't copy and paste answers. You can't talk to other people. But you absolutely, if you want to have a note sheet beside you just to get things from your head onto paper as you start, you can. The other strategy, and Ian, you're going to be better able to talk to this than I am, but with multiple choice, if you don't know what the right answer is, start looking for a wrong answer. And you know that there's going to be more wrong answers than right, and see if you can find something and rule it out. And then by process of elimination, maybe you're like, okay, I can rule out 1 or 2 of these options. Let me go to the next question. I have this limited set, and see if I can do the same there. And then slowly kind of walk yourself through by process of elimination, what might be the right answer there.
Yeah, this is really good advice. We're kind of moving away from the test anxiety. That's okay. I just put a link in the chat box as well. We produced this little kind of advice guide on test anxiety, and it's got some basic ideas there, and describes the square breathing that Jason recommended, and some other things that you can try. These things really, really do work. It sounds like I'm naturally a little bit cynical towards them, because in Britain we think a lot of this sort of positive psychology stuff is sort of North American self-help stuff, but it works. It works really, really well, and you can practice doing these things now. You can practice your breathing exercises now, so that when you're in the test, if for whatever reason you find yourself a bit flustered, you revised, right? You've practiced just like you practice the questions. You practice your response in advance, and you know what you're going to do. You have a plan, and it's normal. Sometimes, like Megan was saying, you're going to have a bad day. You're going to have a bad exam. You wake up with a headache. You're just not feeling it. Things happen. The questions are just all those difficult things that you weren't expecting to come up. It's just a horrible constellation of bad circumstances for you. That's okay. It happens to everyone from time to time. And the beauty of the North American university system is that you never have a do or die exam. It's really rare where you have an exam that's worth such a big portion of your course. The exam decides whether you're going to pass or fail. But in terms of multiple choice, we've sort of circled around this, so I think I'll just leap in there. And students really struggle with multiple choice questions, and I get why. And I think part of the problem is in the prep, as I began to talk about earlier, but also part of the problem is in how to tackle the exam. And so let's say that there are 2 forms of multiple choice exam. There are the kind of exams where, like Jason was talking about, you can go back and forth between the different questions. If that's the kind of exam you have, then I would adopt what we call the 3-pass method. You're going to go through the exam paper 3 times in total. The first time, you're going to look at all of the questions really, really quickly. If you know the answer straight away, or it requires, 2 presses of a calculator, you're going to answer that question. You're certain, you're just going to move forward, and then you're going to look back and think, well, I've banked 20%, 15%, whatever it is. As you go through, you're going to mark the rest of the questions either with a question mark or something similar, or with a cross or something similar. The second time you go through the paper, and this is going to be the majority of your time, this is the second pass, you're going to do all those questions that you weren't quite sure about. Those question mark questions where it's like 50-50, maybe I see some wronger answers and some more correct answers. Maybe there's a lengthy calculation involved. I need to do a bit of brainstorming, a bit of writing, a bit of thinking. And that's going to be 60-70% of your exam time. Then at the end, you're going to go through the last block of questions, the questions you really had no idea about, the stuff you looked at and you're like, this isn't even from Psych 100, this is in French, what's going on here? Answer everything. But the beautiful thing about doing this is you put off all the difficult stuff to the end, the stuff that's otherwise going to preoccupy you. And also it gives you the chance to activate that prior knowledge. Even if you're not thinking about that really tricky question when you're going through the second time and doing all the 50-50 questions, somewhere deep down, your brain is still cranking away. It's been thinking about these things. And this is when we find that the answers sometimes just come to us like a bolt from the blue. But if you just sit there staring at the question and willing yourself to find the answer, you're only going to make yourself more anxious. And the more anxious you get and the more you will yourself, the less likely you are to actually find that answer. So let's see if you can move back and forth. If you can't move back and forth, then here is what I would do. I would set myself a timer. So I know if I have an hour-long exam and I know there's going to be 20 questions, hopefully the prof will have told us this in advance, then I have 3 minutes per question. Set yourself a timer, bring a watch to the exam, so I know I'm going to spend more or less 3 minutes on every question. Of course, if I know the answer straight away, if it's one of those easy ones, I'm going to move forward. But otherwise, if you're looking at a question that's really tough and you're not sure, spend the whole 3 minutes on it. Close your eyes, do some of that doodling, some of that brainstorming, do the breathing exercises. Try producing a mind map, jotting down even what seem like really disconnected ideas, and the answer might come to you, right? And also, this is going to stop you doing this horrible instant gratification thing of, I'm just going to move on from this because I don't want to think about it anymore. Right? It's really tempting just to hit the button, make it go away, and move on to a next question and hope the next question is better. But the problem you have there, if you have one of these exams where you can't move backwards, is, well, what if the next 10 questions are all really tricky questions? And you've got to the end of the exam in 10 minutes flat, but you haven't actually answered any of the questions and now it's too late. Right? And if you're really stuck, like Megan said, look for the wronger answers, look for the answers that seem way beyond the realms of possibility, and then just guess. Just guess, you'll get some points. And if you've been doing your, filing your assignments and getting your participation grades and things like that throughout the course, then you'll get out alive and you'll pass the credit. And although it's disappointing when we don't get the grade we want in a course, of course, everybody wants to get an A in every course. You'll look back and be glad that you got the credit, or that you made the best of the situation, whatever you end up with, and you'll have another go next semester. You know, especially if you're in first year right now, you have a long 4 years ahead of you. And this year is all about building that solid foundation so you can move forward. Does anybody have any questions that they would like us to address? I can just take more questions from our list, but I'm interested to know what people are thinking or what people would like us to talk about. This is usually the way, this is what I expect. Maybe I'll ask another question then about cramming. About cramming, and the question I want to ask is, we know that cramming isn't ideal, right? We know that we shouldn't cram, and everybody knows I shouldn't stay up all night, or I shouldn't stay up super late the night before the exam and try to do all of my Psych 100 prep in one day solid. However, I recognize that we're all human and we're all fallible, and sometimes we procrastinate and life happens. Megan or Jason, can cramming ever work? If you had to cram, what would be the approach to take, and why doesn't cramming work?
Cramming does not work for me, but I am a special being. I like if it's like sleep versus studying, I like need sleep, or it doesn't matter what I'm doing the night before. I recognize that's very different for different people. But for myself, like, I'm going to do better getting 8 hours sleep and like trusting that I was somewhat paying attention for the last 12 weeks than risking my sleep. And I think part of when we're at cramming, we have limited resources. So it's looking into that priority, what works best for me, and understanding, if I do need to shift my priorities, what has worked for me in the past. If I was going to cram in the day before an exam, speaking just from university experience, I would go to the exam bank and then I would memorize the past exam with my time. But I recognize, just for me, it would be looking into the priority of time aspect and making sure that I'm going into the exam like with energy and with like not just haziness.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm the same. I would personally, I prioritize sleep over pretty much everything else because I'm useless without sleep. I won't be able to access anything. I won't be able to pull anything up from memory, and I'll just not be my best. That said, I've certainly crammed for an exam a time or two in my time as a student. I don't know that this is particularly evidence-based, although I could make a hypothesis that I could test. So I throw that out there as a cue for Psych 100 because we talk a lot about skills. So one thing would be to think about what skills have I learned about so far and how could I apply it in different ways. And then at least that way you have a skill that you can demonstrate across multiple domains of a course as a strategy. What I used to do, and again, I don't recommend this. This is like a last ditch scenario if you're in this place. I used to, the afternoon before an exam, I would really kind of study and cram. I would then sleep and prioritize sleep. And I'm somebody who can easily get up at 4 or 5 in the morning, like I'm a morning person. And so I would usually stop studying. I would never study later than 10 o'clock at night because I needed to sleep, and then get up early and refresh. But again, if you're in that place, focus on the learning objectives, focus on the headings for the chapters, and at least have a skeleton so that if there's something related to research methods, you can say, I know I need to know something about a hypothesis here. And so that's something that may carry through different units of the course, and maybe even different courses. So if you're taking courses that have common themes, and you're like, wow, Psych 100 and Bio both talk about having a testable research hypothesis. If I study that, I can maybe, feed 2 birds with 1 scone. I read on Twitter, not kill 2 birds, feed 2 birds with 1 scone, as a strategy. And then that's almost kind of like tricking yourself into making these connections also, which we talk about as being important.
I like that. In an ideal world, you would have a beautiful study schedule that you'll stick to. And I'm going to put a link in the chat box that will take you to a PDF that's filled out that you can fill out for December. That's a little SASS resource. There's some instructions on the second page that's just going to help you plan things out and kind of break things down and create a list of topics. And the reason, it's not that cramming doesn't work, but cramming is deeply unpleasant because you stress yourself out even more. So everybody gets anxious and nervous during exams, and this is only going to heighten that, especially if it impacts your sleep. So sleep is the number one. And if you're tired, your brain just can't make these kind of conceptual and theoretical leaps that we're talking about. You're going to be stuck at that, looking at that superficial stuff. All you're going to be able to remember is facts here and there. So if you've adopted this study approach that I talked about, where you've done tons and tons of cue cards, you've memorized lots of random sort of numbers or dates or something like that from your book, and you're tired and exhausted, well, when you look at the exam and it suddenly just is asking you to look outside of that field of view, it's going to be really hard to do it. So if I had an exam tomorrow and I hadn't started studying, I would probably do what Jason recommended and do practice papers, practice questions, and then I would get some sleep. And I would rather go into the exam well slept without actually having done a full revision set than staying up all night. And I don't have the research papers to prove that that works, because I think it would be a pretty unethical research study to do on students. But I would hypothesize that that would work pretty well.
I do want to just give a heads up, like Psych 100 doesn't use Queen's Exam Bank and many courses don't. So I wouldn't bet on that. So if it's the day before the exam and you're like, hey, they said go to Exam Bank the day before the exam, just be careful because not all exams will be in there for that.
Yeah. Exam Bank doesn't have everything, but what it does have, you're going to love this. Go use it. But the reason that cramming is ineffective, even if, let's say, you slept very well, but you just spent a whole day studying for that exam the next day, is that there are basically 3 really big theories in the science of learning. And they're more than theories in the sense of sort of vague abstract ideas. They're really well proven. The first one is this idea of retrieval. So practice testing, the idea that instead of just looking at my book and telling myself I know the answer, I'm going to close my eyes and see if I can actually remember the answer. This is what we do when we use cue cards, when we don't look at our notes and explain things to our friends, when we do practice essays, when we make summaries, practice papers, we're doing retrieval, right? And you can do retrieval the night before the test. You can do retrieval anytime, and I recommend you do it as much as possible. Every time you do a study session, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes, do some retrieval practice, do some testing practice. The other two things that you're going to love are called space practice and interleaving. And they sound a bit fancy, but they're basically really simple. Space practice is essentially the idea that, let's say you're going to spend an hour studying a particular topic. It is more effective to spend an hour broken up over a period of time, with the intervals between each time you look at something growing, than it is to spend an hour once. So, you know, you would spend 30 minutes on day 1, 15 minutes on day 5, another 10 minutes on day 7, and then 5 minutes to finish off the day before the exam. So if you have a great study schedule where you're starting early, then you can take advantage of space practice. But if you're cramming and plugging everything in one day before the exam, then you can't. You're stuck with that. I'm going to look at something once. And the research on this is just like phenomenal, Megan. You know this, right? But we tend to see in psychological research tiny effect sizes, where basically we look at something and we decide, yeah, it's kind of useful, but the effect is marginal. For space practice, the effect is enormous. The studies will show people boosting their test grades by like 30, 40, 50, 60% in terms of what they can remember. The other thing, interleaving, is, it sounds even more complex, but it's also simple. And interleaving basically says you want to mix up what you're studying, the kind of task you're doing. So the way I usually explain this is that at the end of a chapter, let's say you're studying math and you've been learning about whatever, Pythagoras' theorem for a chapter. At the end of the chapter, you get 100 questions in a row that are really asking you to do the same thing. And students practice for the test by just working through those 100 questions one after the other. So in my study session, let's say in my cramming session, what am I going to do? I'm just going to work through 100 questions in a row. But the problem is, after you've done it a few times, the benefit of working through the same kind of mechanics or the same problems start to diminish really quickly. So mix things up, shuffle the deck, do a few questions from one chapter, a few questions from another chapter. And you can use these 3 theories together when you study to come up with a really efficient way to prepare for exams. Well, let's say you have an hour you're going to study for. Do a little bit of a self-test. Do a little bit of a practice test. Oh, hello. A little bit of a practice test on something you looked at last week. So you're using retrieval and the space practice together. Then spend the 30, 40 minutes reading through something in a bit more detail, making those big questions, maybe writing a big practice answer. And then do something else at the end, so you're forcing yourself to do interleaving, and you'll find that you understand and remember things a lot better and a lot more easily. Hello. Megan, do you want to chip on that? Because I feel you know these theories and you know how effective they are.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I was a little distracted. We have an escape artist. We have 2 escape artists. It's bedtime in my house. We really talk about, you know, the example I like to use is like learning a phone number, right? So how many of us have had to learn phone numbers recently? Not very often, but if you ever need to like think of studying, like learning a phone number, we don't remember it the first time. We usually make mistakes a whole bunch of times. And so in terms of both space practice and interleaving, I love them coupled with retrieval practice. And this is, I think, where a challenge comes up with cramming is because you don't give yourself time to make those mistakes. And those mistakes are actually a really important part of learning. So for example, in my family, we're bad with phone numbers. And so we'll often try to make sure that there's a 2 in a number. So the peace sign, and then you can remember from the peace sign. But if you don't give yourself time to come up with those strategies to make the error, it's hard. Sorry, I was distracted by child. I apologize.
That is more than okay. So I think, this actually takes us back to what we were talking about at the beginning with procrastination. That when I mentioned to you that we would be mentioning that sometimes working in 5 or 10 minute bursts can be really good and can be better than working in these huge chunks of time. This is why. because you can spend 5 or 10 minutes doing something and it's not wasted time, it's not nothing. You can do some retrieval, you can revise something. There's quite a lot you can do in 5 or 10 minutes. And if you just do it regularly, but start early, that is the key, then you're going to find this becomes a lot easier.
I want to throw out there one way of doing this that's super nerdy, but Psych 100 obviously has like thousands of students in it, literally. And there's people who are looking for partners. And I think about study partners. I think about a friend of mine, my study buddy in Kansas, and how we started it was we actually went out and were just having a meal together. And we were drawing out structural equation models on the tablecloth at the restaurant we were at. So it wasn't intended as study time, but we could talk through the concepts. And so if there's an opportunity, also I'm giving a plug to the Psych 100 discussion board again, but there's a section for getting into a study group where people are just getting together, having coffee and talking about the ideas. And Ian, it's coming back to something you said earlier, which is talking it out, talking it through, as opposed to just kind of going through the notes again and again and again. Again, for the content, you want to focus on the learning objectives, but it's that action, that skill again of doing the elaborative and effortful practice. So I really, if you can meet up with somebody, or even through SASS, I don't know if you guys do study buddies.
Michaela, do you want to plug Get It Done and explain how it works?
Absolutely. So we this week are running Get It Done study sessions. So we have one happening tomorrow, Wednesday the 25th, from 6 to 8 p.m. where we put people into breakout rooms based on what you're studying. So we ran our first one yesterday, and we had a breakout room for people working on essays. We had a breakout room for people working on labs and other kind of final projects, then a breakout room for people doing coursework and readings. As well, we had our peer learning assistants there to offer advice on things like study methods, note-taking skills, anti-procrastination techniques, as well as a couple of our PWAs, our peer writing assistants were there if you had any kind of technical questions about writing or wanted to put something by them. So we have 2 45-minute study blocks in the evening where people were able to get a lot of work done. We had someone write, I think, 500 words, they told us, and outlined one of their final essays. So I think that's a success in my win, just because we had it on Zoom. We encourage people to put their cameras on, but we were muted. So you have that bit of accountability through the screen that other people are there working. And then we have some fun brain breaks in the middle if folks want to play a game or giving you that time to rest, your eyes away from the screen. And we do also have prizes at the end if you stay till the 8 o'clock mark. So definitely check them out. You can sign up on the SASS calendar under our workshops page.
Could you grab the link and drop it in the chat box? So I think we're reaching the end of our hour together. So if anyone has questions, feel free to ask them now, or forever hold their peace. Not forever, you can just ask us afterwards. Michaela, could you also just paste in the main SASS email, so if people have questions afterwards, feel free just to send an email to this email address and we'll get back to you with some answers. But I wonder if Megan and Jason, Jerry Springer style, you have a thought for the day, a parting message for us. Sorry, that was a really outdated reference.
I know, I'm like, wow, yes. My thought is that y'all are here, and that is an amazing first step. And so I think showing up, even if even if your kids are barging in, whatever distractions are going on, showing up for yourself, even ideally in small chunks of time, is awesome. And so keep showing up for yourself in small chunks at a time.
Mine was similar, but I can certainly think of something different. I think often going into exams, students know more, especially students who are taking the time to listen to this or to be here, know more than they think that they know. And it's taking that moment of like breath, or taking that moment, I think it was Sierra in the chat earlier, talked about kind of the reframing of procrastination and that compassionate piece. Right before we're getting something done, it feels like a really great time to be critical to push us forward to get that last ounce of energy out. But I promise you're going to have a lot of energy right before or during an exam, because anxiety is energy. It's not energy that we always love, but it's certainly energy. And kind of reframing and taking that time to even think about, like, someone who cares about me, what would they tell me stepping into this exam? And writing it down or repeating it to myself and then taking those breaths can be really great in how we repurpose or reframe what that moment looks like stepping into the exam space or clicking into the exam space.
Excellent. Then thank you both for those good words. I don't really have anything to add except to say that I know it's been a difficult semester for many of you, and it's been an extremely unusual experience for all of you. But like Megan said, you're still here, and like Jason said, you probably know more than you think, and you're probably further ahead than you think. So I wish you the best of luck for exams. If you want to come and work with someone, talk about study plans, test anxiety, getting your assignments written, really anything you need, then you can come and work with us at SASS. You can meet me or someone much better than me, because I have brilliant colleagues here. And you know, all of the advice that we've given is general advice. When we talk about psychological theories, you know, we're talking about numbers and averages that thousands of people, and everybody's procrastination is unique. Everybody's anxiety is unique. What works for everybody is unique. But now is a great time to experiment. See what you can pick from the things that we've talked about today. Try one or two new things this time around. If it works, great, stick with it. Try something else next time. If it doesn't, no harm done. So thank you to both Megan and Jason for freely giving up your Tuesday evenings and your children's bedtimes. And thank you, Michaela, for organizing the Zoom. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Sorry for the kid interruption. Such is life, right?
It's okay. This is life right now.
Good night, everyone.